Hello guys, it's time to get comfortable and let your mind wander through the ages. Close your eyes and imagine the cool marble halls of the Vatican, silent and dimly lit by gentle lantern light. Feel the smooth, ancient stone under your feet and the hush of centuries in the air. As we drift together through this quiet story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps us keep whispering history to sleep. Take a slow, deep breath. With each exhale, let your body relax a little more into your bed. Tonight, we'll journey calmly through the long and secretive history of the Vatican. There's no rush at all. Simply listen to my voice as I guide you through tales of the past, softly and slowly. Picture the towering columns and high-vaulted ceilings above as if you are walking the Vatican corridors at night, alone with your thoughts. The world outside is quiet now, and in the stillness, the echoes of history become clearer. Let's begin our gentle voyage back in time. Imagine yourself in a vast courtyard at dusk, nearly 2,000 years ago. You're standing on Vatican Hill, just outside Rome. The air is cool and still. In the gathering twilight, you can make out an Egyptian obelisk standing tall. Yes, the same one that stands in St. Peter's Square today. In this early era, the spot where you stand is a simple open field, part of a circus or racetrack built by the Emperor Nero. This place has already seen tragedy and drama. If you listen carefully, you might almost hear distant echoes of a crowd from long ago. It was in this very area, according to ancient tradition, that St. Peter met his fate. Peter, the fisherman turned apostle, was said to be crucified here during Emperor Nero's persecution of Christians. Around the year 64 AD, the very name Vatican comes from Mons Vaticanus, the Latin name for this hill, which in pagan times held gardens and even a chariot racecourse. As you imagine the scene, it's not violent or harsh in our telling, just a solemn moment under a blue Roman sky, Peter looking up with faith and acceptance. After his death, his followers took his body and buried it quietly in a humble grave on this hill, a place that was then a simple cemetery outside the city walls. For years, that grave was marked and revered in secret by early Christians. They would come by night or in the early dawn to pray, risking their safety for the memory of their beloved teacher. In those early centuries, many Christians worshipped in the shadows. Picture a small group of them in a catacomb beneath the city. An underground cemetery tunnel lit by the soft glow of oil lamps. They huddle near a martyr's grave to celebrate a hidden mass. The walls around them marked with tiny fish symbols and scratched prayers. There is a faint scent of wax and damp earth. They sing a hymn, but softly, as their voices echo off the carved niches containing the bones of their departed faithful. Such were the humble origins of the church's worship, in caves and homes, in secrecy and courage. The hippogrific non insayables on Vatican Hill too, long before any basilica, the faithful lightly crept to Peter's burial place under cover of darkness. In fact, archaeologists in the 20th century discovered ancient graffiti on a wall near Peter's tomb that reads, in rough Latin, "Peter is here." It seems even then, devotees left tangible signs of their devotion. From those quiet catacomb gatherings and clandestine visits to a simple grave would eventually blossom the magnificent Vatican we know. But it's worth remembering, it all started in the flicker of hidden lamplight, sustained by unwavering faith. Time drifts onward. The persecutions pass and centuries slide by like gentle waves. The Roman Empire eventually embraces the once outlawed faith. Now imagine the scene in the 4th century. The year is 326 AD. The Emperor Constantine, who has legalized Christianity, decides to honor the Apostle Peter. Workmen bustle quietly on this hillside, clearing away earth and old tombs. Constantine orders a great basilica to be built right above Peter's burial site. By imperial decree, the simple grave of a martyr becomes the foundation of a grand church. Picture the early basilica taking shape. Wooden scaffolds rising, stones being laid by countless hands and artisans, gently carving ornate pillars. This is Old St. Peter's Basilica, the predecessor to the magnificent church we know today. In your mind's eye, see it standing proudly with a long nave and a courtyard, glittering mosaics and a roof of timber beams. It's simpler than the modern St. Peter's, but still impressive for its time. Constantine's Basilica will stand for over 1,000 years as a holy shrine. Pilgrims from distant lands will travel for months, arriving footsore and weary just to pray near the tomb of Peter beneath the altar, and they enter the cool, dim sanctuary with candles flickering and incense wafting in sunbeams, feeling a profound peace in this sacred space. Through the long twilight of antiquity and the early Middle Ages, the bishops of Rome, whom we now call popes, grow in influence. At first, they are spiritual leaders among many bishops, guiding Christians in Italy and beyond. But as the old Roman Empire crumbles in the West, something interesting happens. The church starts to fill the void of authority. Imagine Rome in the 6th century. The once great imperial city is in decay, its marble ruins scattered, wolves, by rumor, roaming the streets at night. In this fragile world, Pope Gregory the Great takes charge, around 590 AD. In a soft-spoken yet determined manner, he organizes food for the starving populace, sends missionaries to distant lands like Britain, and negotiates with barbarian kings at the gates. Visualize him walking through plague-stricken streets, leading a solemn procession with prayers to end a pestilence. The people begin to look to their pope, not just for spiritual comfort, but for practical leadership and protection. By now, the Vatican area, and Rome as a whole, is not merely a place of worship, but a center of administration. Although the popes of this era often reside at the Lateran Palace, on the other side of Rome, they cherish St. Peter's Basilica as a jewel of Christendom. Monks and scribes in these centuries carefully copy manuscripts in candle-lit rooms, preserving not only scriptures and letters, but also classical texts of history and philosophy. You can almost hear the scratch of quill pens on parchment if you listen to the silence deeply enough. These scribes, in their plain robes, don't realize it, but they are quietly saving knowledge through the darkest times, tucking away precious words in the church's keeping. Vatican Hill and its environs are becoming a safe harbor for learning, even as storms of chaos rage across Europe. Now, the scene shifts gently to the 8th century. The church's influence has extended beyond spiritual matters. In a modest chamber illuminated by oil lamps, a pope and a Frankish king's envoys meet in secret discussions. The topic is protection. Who will guard Rome and the pope from aggressive Lombard neighbors? In 754 AD, a Frankish ruler, King Pepin the Short, grants the pope control of lands in central Italy. This donation of Pepin is real and significant. It marks the birth of the papal states, territories where the pope is not just a religious leader, but a temporal ruler, like a king. To bolster these temporal claims, the medieval church even circulated a document called the Donation of Constantine, which purported that the ancient emperor Constantine had granted the pope dominion over Rome and the entire Western Empire. For centuries, popes cited this document to legitimize their authority over kings and lands. Only in the 15th century did a scholar, Lorenzo Valla, prove through careful analysis that the donation was a forgery, written long after Constantine. It was a quietly momentous revelation. One of the pillars of papal political authority had been based on myth. Long before that truth came out, however, the church had treated the donation as fact. It's a reminder of how, in those times, a bit of well-kept fiction could bolster real power. The papacy, once persecuted, now wears a crown, figuratively speaking, and commands armies, administers laws, and coins money. Many popes by now are both spiritual fathers and secular princes. One moment, a pope might be in a simple chapel praying silently. The next, he might be in an audience chamber, draped in rich robes, receiving ambassadors from far-off courts. This dual identity will define the Vatican's character for centuries to come. As the early Middle Ages unfold, alliances between the papacy and European monarchs become ever more important. In your mind, see a grand scene on Christmas Day of the year 800. Inside the old St. Peter's Basilica, candles burn brightly and the air is thick with incense. Kneeling before the high altar is King Charlemagne of the Franks, a towering figure draped in a simple cloak. Pope Leo III, in resplendent vestments, gently places a crown on Charlemagne's bowed head and proclaims him Emperor of the Romans. The gathered crowd of churchmen and nobles burst into an acclamation. This moment, a pope crowning an emperor, symbolizes the intertwined fate of the church and European royalty. The Vatican, though not yet a sovereign state as we think of it now, has asserted a role as kingmaker. Through a soft ceremonial act, the Pope has revived the idea of a Western Roman Empire with the Church as its soul. Imagine how powerful and delicate this balance is. The Pope and the Emperor are now bound in partnership. Each needs the other. The Emperor gains legitimacy from the Church's blessing, and the Church gains a mighty protector for Christendom. Of course, not all relationships between popes and monarchs will be harmonious. In the centuries ahead, these alliances will wax and wane, sometimes warm and cooperative, other times fraught with tension or outright conflict. Drift forward in time to the High Middle Ages. The Vatican and the Papal Court have grown in stature and complexity. By now, the Pope has a group of close advisors, the College of Cardinals, who assist in governance and will elect future popes. The Church's bureaucracy is expanding, with clerks and notaries writing letters to kings, issuing decrees and managing the papal states. Many documents are being produced, papal bulls, sealed with lead, secret correspondences, legal judgments, and copies of all are stored away for safekeeping. We are witnessing the gradual birth of what will become the Vatican's archives. Though at this point in history, these records are kept in chests and cupboards across various basilicas and palaces, not yet centralized, they are already guarded carefully. Knowledge is power, and the Church knows this well. We find ourselves now in the 11th century. The Church's power has reached a height where it can even challenge kings and emperors. A gentle snow is falling in the winter of 1077, and we are at Canossa Castle in the Italian Apennines. Picture a proud but penitent German emperor, Henry IV, standing barefoot in the snow outside the castle gates. He has been excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII during a fierce dispute over who has the authority to appoint bishops, a conflict known as the investiture controversy. Excommunication means Henry is cut off from the Church and, by medieval belief, from salvation itself. His nobles have turned against him until he is reconciled with the Church. So here he stands for 3 days, humbling himself in the cold, begging forgiveness. Finally, the Pope relents and lifts the excommunication. The image of an emperor kneeling and a pope forgiving, both of them shivering in the winter air, shows just how much spiritual authority the Vatican wields. Meanwhile, relations with the eastern half of Christendom have been deteriorating. Just a couple of decades earlier, in 1054, a tragic split occurred between Rome and Constantinople, known as the Great Schism. Differences in theology, politics, and culture had long strained the Latin West and Greek East. That year, mutual excommunications were exchanged. The Pope's legates placed a decree of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and the Patriarch in turn anathematized the legates. It was a very quiet breaking point. No armies or battles, just parchment and wax seals delivered in anger. Yet it tore Christianity into two great halves, the Catholic Church in the West and the Orthodox Church in the East. The Vatican suddenly no longer spoke for all of Christendom. This wounded unity persisted through the centuries. During the Crusades, the rift only grew, especially after Western Crusaders shamefully sacked Constantinople in 1204, deepening Eastern resentment. The popes in Rome and the patriarchs in Constantinople fell largely silent toward each other, each guarding their own traditions in isolation. Only many centuries later, in 1965, would those old excommunications finally be symbolically lifted when Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras met and embraced in a gesture of reconciliation. It was a tender step toward healing, but full communion has yet to be restored. The Great Schism remains another quiet sorrow in the Vatican's history, a reminder that even spiritual siblings can become estranged, and that some wounds take long ages to mend. As the medieval world gives way to the era of Crusades, another dramatic chapter unfolds. In 1095, Pope Urban II stands on a makeshift wooden platform in a field in France, addressing a large crowd. His voice, though perhaps hoarse with emotion, we will imagine as calm yet resolute in our story. He calls upon the nobility and knights of Europe to embark on a great journey to the Holy Land, to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. This call ignites what we know as the First Crusade. Now, in our peaceful contemplation, we won't dwell on the violence of the Crusades. Instead, we note how a single speech by a pope moved thousands of people across Europe to take up the cross and march to unknown lands. Across hills and valleys, entire families and armies start moving after that call, chanting Deus Vult, God wills it. It's a testament to the Vatican's extraordinary reach, a spiritual leader mobilizing a continent through the persuasive power of faith for purposes both lofty and at times tragically misguided. Over the next 2 centuries, multiple crusades are launched with papal approval. While you are resting, perhaps you can envision lines of armored knights leaving Europe's shores in creaking wooden ships, banners bearing the cross fluttering above them. Back in Rome, the popes continue with their daily prayers and administration, but they keenly follow news from the East. They correspond with kings and crusader generals, sometimes in cipher or secret letters, advising or pleading. Each piece of correspondence is copied by scribes and tucked away in the papal chancery's rolls. The Vatican's memory grows thicker with these records of alliances, battles, and treaties. Now we must speak of something darker that took root in this medieval time, the Inquisition. It's an uncomfortable part of history, but we will handle it calmly and factually as a distant echo. By the 13th century, the Church felt threatened by various teachings it deemed heretical, beliefs that deviated from official doctrine. In towns of southern France, for instance, the Cathars preached a different spirituality that alarmed Rome. The response from the Vatican was secretive and stern, a system of church tribunals to investigate and root out heresy. This came to be known as the Inquisition. In our mind's eye, we see an inquisitorial chamber not as a scene of horror, but as a dimly lit, stone-walled room somewhere in medieval France or Italy. A stern-faced but soft-spoken friar, perhaps a Dominican inquisitor, questions an individual accused of heresy. A quill pen scratches as a clerk takes careful notes of the testimony. Sometimes the methods were harsh. The threat of torture loomed, and indeed torture was sometimes used to extract confessions. Punishments for those who refused to recant could be severe, often handed over to secular authorities to carry out grim sentences. The atmosphere is tense, but let's keep it at a remove. Perhaps we hear only the muffled murmurs of questioning and the rustle of parchment. The individuals involved are long gone, leaving only faded records. The Inquisition's reach expands over time. By the late 1000s, 400s in Spain, the Spanish Inquisition, though under the Spanish crown's control, operates with papal approval. It targets converts from Judaism and Islam, suspected of secretly clinging to their old faiths, as well as any others deemed heretics. It's jarring to picture in such a gentle narrative, but imagine the fear that a knock on the door in the middle of the night could bring in those days. The whisper that an inquisitor had arrived in town. Families might quickly hide books or papers that could be deemed suspicious. For many, silence and secrecy become a means of survival. The legacy of the Inquisition is a lasting shadow on the Vatican's story. Although these tribunals were meant to safeguard unity of belief, they created an atmosphere of fear and repression. People learnt to be careful about their speech and beliefs. Knowledge considered dangerous was hidden or destroyed, though often at the cost of truth and humanity. Centuries later, in the year 2000, Pope John Paul II publicly prayed for forgiveness for the sins of the Inquisition and other wrongs in church history during a special day of pardon ceremony. It was a striking scene. Cardinals in purple vestments standing in St. Peter's Basilica and confessing that the church, in pursuing supposed good, had done great harm. This act of apology did not undo the past, but it acknowledged it openly, breaking centuries of silence with a plea for reconciliation. Yet even amid such strict control, the medieval Vatican could not extinguish curiosity and learning. In the quiet cloisters of monasteries and in the early universities of Europe, scholars, many of them clergy, debated philosophy and studied the natural world. The church itself produced brilliant minds. For example, Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century gently harmonized reason and faith, writing works of theology by candlelight that tried to reconcile Aristotle's philosophy with Christian doctrine. The Vatican watched over this intellectual ferment with measured caution. At times it encouraged learning, at times it censored it. It was a delicate balance, fostering the light of knowledge while guarding against what it saw as the flames of heresy. By the 14th century, another crisis strikes the papacy, a division not of faith but of leadership. In 1309, Pope Clement V, under the influence of the French crown, moves the papal residence from Rome to Avignon in southern France. For nearly 70 years, popes lived in Avignon, in comfortable quarters along the Rhone River, rather than in Rome. Picture lush vineyards and a stately Gothic palace in Avignon, and the Pope holding court there, somewhat removed from St. Peter's tomb and the Roman people. This period, often called the Avignon papacy, sees 7 popes, all French, who are sometimes accused of being too influenced by French kings. Back in Rome, the old Basilica of St. Peter's and the Lateran Palace fall into disrepair without the papal court's presence. It's as if the heart of the Vatican is dormant during that exile, awaiting the return of its bishop. When the papacy finally moves back to Rome in 1377, this move is influenced in part by the pleas of St. Catherine of Siena, a deeply spiritual mystic who implored Pope Gregory XI to return to the seat of Peter. Catherine, though merely a laywoman, writes letters claiming divine visions, urging the Pope that peace and God's will await him in Rome. Her heartfelt persuasion helps convince Gregory the Elector to pack up the Avignon court and come home. It showed how even a simple holy voice could affect great decisions. Soon after, there follows an even more bewildering time, the Great Western Schism. After one pope settles again in Rome, rival cardinals in France refuse to accept him and elect a different pope in Avignon. By 1378, there are 2 men claiming to be the true pope. Within a few years, a third claimant pops up. For nearly 40 years, the Christian world is divided in loyalty. At one point, there are indeed 3 individuals simultaneously claiming to be pope. Imagine how confusing and scandalous this is. Churches in different regions praying for different popes, kings choosing sides, messengers dashing between courts carrying letters of allegiance or excommunication. It must have been deeply disconcerting for ordinary believers, like a family watching parents quarrel bitterly. Eventually, the schism is healed at the Council of Constance in 1417. Church leaders and theologians from across Europe gather in a great assembly to resolve the crisis. One by one, the rival popes are persuaded or forced to resign, or in one case, simply ignored until he faded away, and a new consensus, Pope Martin V, is elected to reunite the church. In a symbolic act of humility similar to that long ago seen at Canossa, one of the claimants, Pope Gregory XII, agrees to resign for the good of the church in 1415, voluntarily laying down his tiara to end the chaos. It's a rare, voluntary papal resignation, the first in centuries, done to heal the schism. This resolution brings immense relief. Finally, one pope is universally recognized again. The Vatican can once more speak with a single voice, but the memory of that disunity lingers and will make the church cautious for a long time to come. And interestingly, for the next 600 years, no pope will resign willingly again, until Benedict XVI in 2013, a fact we will revisit calmly later in our story. The scars of the schism remain a lesson about the perils of factionalism and the importance of unity. Now, the 15th and 16th centuries arrive, the time we call the Renaissance. The world is awakening to art, science, and the beauty of classical learning, reborn. The popes of this era are at the forefront of patronage, transforming the very skyline of the Vatican. Old St. Peter's Basilica, which had stood since Constantine's time, is now aging and unstable. In 1506, Pope Julius II lays the first stone of a magnificent new St. Peter's Basilica. As you relax, picture the construction spanning over 100 years. Generation after generation of architects and artists labored to create the grand church we know today. Michelangelo Buonarroti, in his older years, designing the graceful dome that will crown it. Raphael painting tapestries and planning frescoes for the papal apartments. Bernini later shaping St. Peter's Square with its welcoming colonnades like open arms. the Vatican becomes an unrivaled repository of art and splendor. The cool marble halls we imagined at the story's start might very well be from this Renaissance period, polished and echoing with the footfalls of artists, bishops, and visiting nobles. But alongside this splendor comes corruption and worldliness. Some Renaissance popes act more like princes than spiritual fathers. There is nepotism. Indeed, the word nepotism itself comes from nephew, because popes often elevate their nephew, who were sometimes their own illegitimate sons, to high office. There is lavish spending on banquets, palaces, and art. You might wander in imagination into a 16th century papal banquet. Tables groaning with roasted meats and wines from across Italy, music playing softly in the background, while the Pope, perhaps Pope Alexander VI of the Borgia family, infamous for his extravagance, dines with his family and favorite. These worldly excesses do not go unnoticed or uncriticized. Many devout Catholics yearn for a more pious church, and murmurs of reform grow quietly louder. The simmering discontent reaches a boiling point in 1517 in a region far from Rome. In Wittenberg, Germany, a monk and scripture professor named Martin Luther nails a paper to a church door. His 95 theses challenging the church's practice of selling indulgences. Essentially, the church offering reductions of punishment for sins in exchange for donations, which were being used in part to fund the new St. Peter's construction and other projects. Luther's protest is like a thunderclap in a quiet sky. His ideas spread quickly thanks to the recent invention of the printing press, and soon a full-blown movement for reform, the Protestant Reformation, is underway. The Vatican, caught somewhat off guard, responds in the way it knows best, through official proclamations and ultimately through condemnation. Pope Leo X, a Renaissance prince of a pope who reportedly said, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it," sees Luther's teachings as a direct threat to the unity of the church and to papal authority. In 1521, he issues a papal bull, a formal decree titled Deset Romanum Pontificem, essentially casting Luther out of the church. Think of that document, written in Latin on thick parchment, each word carefully inscribed by scribes, and at the bottom a lead seal bearing the images of Saints Peter and Paul attached by a cord. Couriers carry copies of this bull across Europe. One copy reaches Luther in Germany. He reportedly throws it into a bonfire in defiance. This dramatic gesture signals that the rupture is final. Christendom is cleaving into Catholic and Protestant camps. The Vatican now enters a period of intense self-scrutiny and defensive action known as the Counter-Reformation. Pope Paul III convenes the Council of Trent in 1545, a long-running council that will meet intermittently over 18 years until 1563 to address church reform and clarify doctrine in the face of Protestant challenges. Imagine a grand hall in Trento, Italy. Cardinals, bishops, and abbots from all over Catholic Europe gather, many wearing simple robes, earnest expressions on their faces. By candlelight and daylight, in heated debates and sincere prayers, they decide the church's course. They do reform some corrupt practices, such as training priests better and cracking down on the sale of indulgences, but they also strongly reaffirm traditional Catholic doctrines like the authority of the Pope, the role of Mary and the saints, and the importance of both scripture and church tradition. They tackle issues like disciplining clergy and promoting education to renew the church from within. The council also takes a hard line on controlling ideas. It confirms the role of the Inquisition in combating heresy and creates an official Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. Now, picture, in a small side room off the council hall, a committee of learned men compiling a list of writings deemed dangerous to faith or morals. The index is published and subsequently updated over the years. This list includes not only works of open heresy, but sometimes scientific works or philosophical treatises that the church finds troubling. The printing press, which spread Luther's message, is now printing many books, and the Church seeks to rein in those presses. In local dioceses, bishops quietly instruct their clergy to report any banned books they encounter. Certain texts must be kept locked away, accessible only with special permission. The Vatican itself holds copies of many forbidden books, stored deep in its library, ironically preserving what it won't permit ordinary people to read. This is a poignant image, knowledge literally under lock and key in the Vatican. On the one hand, the Church is preserving these works, some of which would have been lost entirely if not for Vatican librarians safeguarding them. But on the other hand, it is denying their content to the faithful. One such forbidden work, for example, is Nicolaus Copernicus's On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, published in 1543, which proposes that the Earth revolves around the Sun. Initially, the Church does not react strongly to Copernicus, but as the implications sink in that this heliocentric model challenges the traditional interpretation of Scripture and the cosmos as then understood, the book is eventually placed on the index until corrected. It will remain effectively banned for centuries. This brings us to a famous and oft retold chapter in Vatican history, the trial of Galileo Galilei. Let's set the scene in your mind gently. It is 1633, and Galileo, now an elderly man, is standing in a hall at the Inquisition's palace in Rome, not far from the Vatican. He's not in a dungeon, as some lurid tales suggest, but in a stately chamber, perhaps with a fresco on the wall and light filtering in through high windows. Church officials in their robes sit at a table. Galileo, who through his telescope has gathered evidence supporting Copernicus's heliocentric model, is accused of vehement suspicion of heresy for holding this view after a prior warning. Over several days of questioning, imagine the hushed dialogue, the quill pens recording each of Galileo's answers. The brilliant scientist defends himself as best he can, but ultimately, to avoid harsher punishment, Galileo submits. In a solemn ceremony, he kneels and reads a prepared statement renouncing the heliocentric theory, asserting that he abjures, curses, and detests the heresy that the Earth moves. Historical legend says that as he rose, Galileo muttered under his breath, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves, referring to the Earth. Whether he actually whispered those words, we cannot be sure, but the sentiment captures the tension between evidence and doctrine. After his trial, Galileo is not thrown into a dungeon. Instead, the Church confines him to house arrest in a comfortable villa. He lives out his final years quietly, continuing scientific work on motion and mechanics, and even corresponds politely with some clerical friends. But he cannot publish further on heliocentrism, and his great book Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems remains on the index of banned books. For the Vatican, the Galileo episode is a demonstration of its resolve at the time to control the narrative of truth. To later generations, it becomes the emblem of the Church's conflict with science. Even at the time, some within the Vatican privately know that Galileo's ideas will likely be vindicated by future discoveries. But institutions, especially ancient ones like the Catholic Church, often move slowly and cautiously. The officials in 1633 probably think they are defending the faith from confusion and error. They could not foresee that centuries later, the Church would officially acknowledge Galileo's correctness and the mistake made in condemning him. Indeed, in 1992, over 350 years later, Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged that the Church had erred in the Galileo affair, effectively admitting that truth cannot contradict truth and that Scripture and science address different aspects of reality. Over time, the Church gradually makes peace with scientific truths. By 1950, Pope Pius XII states that there is no inherent conflict between the idea of evolution and the doctrine of creation, so long as one holds that the human soul is created by God. And in 1996, Pope John Paul II goes further, affirming that evolution is more than a mere hypothesis, recognizing it as well submitted by cumulative scientific research. The Vatican establishes its own Pontifical Academy of Sciences, inviting expert researchers from around the world including many Nobel Prize winners, to advise on scientific matters and to show that faith welcomes genuine knowledge. It even operates a modern astronomical observatory. In fact, the Vatican Observatory has a telescope in Arizona where Jesuit astronomers scan the heavens to study galaxies and nebulas. Imagine them, a Jesuit priest in observatory domes under the clear desert night, or atop Castel Gandolfo near Rome, gazing at the stars through a powerful telescope, demonstrating that faith and science can not only coexist, but enrich each other. Such a scene, a priest charting galaxies with a computer and telescope, would have been unthinkable in Galileo's day. Now it is a quiet reality, reflective of how far the Vatican has come. These and other historical adjustments are stored near the Vatican Library in Rome. Like any archive, there are stacks and reading rooms, and because it's the Vatican, there are also underground vaults and bunkers, a fireproof structure designed to protect fragile documents from the elements and flame. There's even a school for clergy who study history. And of course, being the Vatican, there is plenty of sacred art on the walls to inspire those who come to learn from the past. Not just anyone can access the archives or library. It's only open to vetted scholars who meet strict criteria. For centuries, the archives remained closed, but in recent times, the Vatican has become a bit more open with its secrets. In 2010, in response to the swirl of public interest and myths perpetuated by popular novels like Dan Brown's Angels and Demons, the Vatican even allowed a group of journalists to tour portions of the secret archives for the first time, to demystify them. The reporters saw well-lit reading rooms and climate-controlled vaults, not dark crypts full of curses. In 2012, to mark the archive's 400th anniversary, the Vatican's Secret Archives, as they were then called, put on a public exhibition of some of its most important documents in a show titled Lux in Arcana, Light on the Secrets. In that exhibit, 100 precious documents dating from the 8th to the 20th century were displayed in Rome's Capitoline museums. They included, for example, the 1521 papal bull excommunicating Martin Luther and the last letter of Mary, Queen of Scots, written in 1587 to Pope Sixtus V while she awaited execution. Mary's handwriting heartbreakingly beseeching the Pope to intervene and save her life. Also on display was a parchment containing King Henry VIII of England's request for an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon in the 1530s, Southern denial of which would spark England's break from Rome. There was even a note from Michelangelo complaining that he had not been paid for his work on the Sistine Chapel's ceiling. These artifacts, fragile but enduring, connect us tangibly to the human dramas behind history. The Vatican seemed to be saying these are the real stories, stories of faith, fear, hope, and intrigue. Dramatic in their own right, without need of invented conspiracies. Modern fiction has indeed amplified imaginings about the Vatican. Dan Brown's best-selling novels painted the Vatican as a hive of secret societies, hidden tombs, and ominous mysteries. While entertaining, those stories are fictional, though they left a mark on the popular psyche. The Vatican, bemused but not wanting misinformation to spread, has tried in its gentle way to counter such fanciful ideas by showcasing the genuine wonders of its history, as with that 2012 exhibit. The reality, as we've been exploring, is already rich and intriguing, even if it lacks demons and Da Vinci codes. In truth, the Vatican archives and libraries are places where scholars quietly turn pages of parchment in search of understanding. A far cry from the catacombs full of dark secrets that some imagine, these and other historical documents are stored on shelves that, if laid end to end, would stretch for over 50 miles. The indexes are not public, and as we mentioned, only scholars with permission can enter, typically to study papers at least 75 years old. Recent papal documents remain confidential for a period. This built-in delay fuels speculation about what might lie within. But even so, more and more material has been gradually made available, In 1881, Pope Leo XIII, known as an intellectual, first opened the secret archives to researchers, declaring, "We are not afraid of history." It was a bold move to confront modern scholarship rather than hide from it. Since then, popes have periodically allowed access to collections that might settle historical questions. For example, in 1998, the Vatican opened the Inquisition archives from the 16th, 17th centuries, allowing historians to sift through trial records like Galileo's and others. In 2002, Pope John Paul II allowed scholars to see files relating to Vatican relations with Germany in the interwar period, 1922-1939, to put an end to unjust and thoughtless speculation about the Church's conduct toward the rise of Nazism. And in our own time, in 2019, Pope Francis announced that the Vatican would open its archives for the pontificate of Pope Pius XII, 193-91958. The Church is not afraid of history, Francis said to an audience of archivists and scholars, echoing Leo XIII a century earlier. True to his word, on March the 10th, 2020, those World War II era archives were opened to researchers, an event eagerly awaited by historians keen to examine the Vatican's actions and inactions during the Holocaust. It was a significant step toward transparency. The archives opened just days before the world shut down for the COVID-19 pandemic, a bit of irony in the timing, but they have since been reopened and studied. Now, as our tale moves into the 17th and 18th centuries, the world outside the Vatican is changing rapidly. The Age of Enlightenment dawns, with philosophers championing reason, liberty, and skepticism of old institutions. The Church loses power in places as secular governments rise. There are revolutions, America, France, and new notions of equality that challenge the old order to which the Vatican was deeply tied. The Vatican's response is often defensive. For instance, in 1864, Pope Pius IX issues the Syllabus of Errors, a list condemning many modern ideas such as freedom of religion, the separation of church and state, and the notion that the Pope should not wield temporal power. This uncompromising stand against liberalism and modernity reveals how besieged the Vatican feels by the changes sweeping through society. Pius is drawing lines in the sand, trying to preserve the old order against a tide of new ideologies. Yet the tide of history is relentless. By the time of Pius IX's long reign, he serves 1-8-4-6-1-8-7-8. The movement for Italian unification is in full swing. The Papal States, those lands Pepin gave so long ago, are the last obstacle to a united kingdom of Italy. In 1870, Rome itself is taken by Italian troops. Pius IX locks himself within the Vatican walls and refuses to recognize the Italian kingdom's authority over Rome. He considers himself a prisoner. Indeed, for nearly 60 years, his stance is maintained by his successors. Popes will not set foot outside the Vatican and will refuse any interaction with the Italian government. They call themselves prisoners in the Vatican. Within the 108 acres of the Vatican, the popes still have their gardens and courtyards to roam. One can picture Pius IX in the late 19th century strolling along the gravel paths of the Vatican gardens at twilight, rosary in hand. The gardens, notably largely fragrant and skilled, an enchanting pocket of nature with manicured hedges, fragrant orange trees, and little grottos, provides solace. As he walks, the sounds of Rome are distant. Inside these walls he hears mostly chirping birds and the soft splash of a fountain. In one corner stands a replica of the Grotto of Lourdes, in another an ancient olive tree. This is the Pope's confined kingdom. No lands across Italy anymore, but these serene gardens where he can pray and reflect, feeling the earth under his feet, yet keeping his eyes on heaven. That image of a white-robed figure quietly praying among the roses and palms, while beyond the walls a modern city bustles, captures the poignancy of the era. The popes maintain an almost monastic seclusion in the heart of a now secular capital. Some thought the papacy might fade away now that it had no temporal power, but instead, something interesting happens. The popes emphasize their spiritual authority even more. In 1870, ironically the very year Rome is lost, Pope Pius IX convenes the First Vatican Council. One defining outcome of that council is the formal declaration of papal infallibility, stating that the Pope, when solemnly defining doctrine on faith or morals ex cathedra, from the chair of St. Peter, is preserved from error by the Holy Spirit. Many see this as the papacy reasserting its supreme spiritual role at the precise moment its worldly rule is collapsed. Not all Catholics are comfortable with the infallibility doctrine at the time, but it becomes a cornerstone of Catholic teaching. It's as if the Vatican, stripped of one kind of power, doubles down on another, more mystical kind of authority that no king or army can steal. Within the Vatican walls during this period, daily life continues in a peculiar quiet. The city of Rome throbs outside, modernizing, yet inside the Leonine walls, it is as if time stands still. The Vatican refuses to acknowledge Italy. Popes even avoid looking out from the Vatican Hill towards the Italian government buildings in Rome to symbolize their protest. This standoff, known as the Roman Question, will not be resolved until 1929. At last, in 1929, a solution comes. Pope Pius XI and the Italian leader Benito Mussolini sign the Lateran Treaty. With this agreement, the Vatican city-state is created as a new tiny sovereign country, just 0.2 square miles. The Pope formally relinquishes claim to the old papal states and accepts the Kingdom of Italy, with Rome as its capital. Italy, in turn, recognizes the Pope's sovereignty over Vatican City and agrees to compensate the Church for the lost territories. The prisoner in the Vatican situation ends. Vatican City now has its own flag, its own tiny railroad station, even its own postage stamps and newspaper. The Pope is a head of state once again, albeit of the smallest state in the world. It's a curious sight. Swiss guards still stand at the gates as they have for centuries, but now behind them is a internationally recognized micronation. The 20th century also sees the Vatican embracing new technology to spread its message. In 1931, the Vatican founds its own radio station, with the pioneering wireless inventor Guglielmo Marconi personally setting up the transmitter within Vatican City. Pope Pius XI speaks on air to the world, and Vatican radio becomes a means to reach the faithful far beyond Rome's walls. During World War II, its broadcasters carefully provide information, solace, and even coded messages to help prisoners and others in need, all while avoiding overt political statements that might cause the occupying powers to silence it. Over time, Vatican radio expands to many languages, a gentle voice carried by electromagnetic waves across continents, uniting listeners in prayer and reflection. Later, the Vatican will also cautiously embrace television and the internet, stepping into each new medium to continue whispering its message of faith into the modern world. Now the world enters a tumultuous new era. The 1930s and 1940s bring the catastrophe of World War II. The Vatican finds itself a neutral island in a sea of conflict. Pope Pius XI had condemned racist ideologies in general terms. In 1938, he famously said, "Spiritually, we are all Semites," criticizing anti-Semios, but he dies in early 1939. His successor, Pope Pius XII, must navigate the treacherous waters of global war. We find ourselves on a quiet evening in 1942, walking the Vatican gardens with Pope Pius XII. The war rages around, but within these walls, all is calm, at least on the surface. Pius XII, a slender, reserved man, often seen in a white cassock, pacing thoughtfully under the olive trees, carries a heavy burden. He has chosen a path of diplomatic neutrality, hoping to act as a possible mediator and to protect the Church's interests and lives on all sides. But news reaches him daily of atrocities, especially the persecution of Jews across Europe. And then, secretly, the Pope uses the Church's networks to save lives where possible. Convents and monasteries in Rome hide several hundred Jewish refugees. Vatican diplomats in countries like Hungary and Slovakia quietly issue protective letters and baptismal certificates to Jews to help them avoid deportation. Pius XII knows of plots too. German generals have reached out through intermediaries about possibly overthrowing Hitler, asking if the Pope would help broker peace with the Allies if they succeed. In 1940, Pius XII even conveys to the British that certain German officers are ready to act against Hitler if they have assurances of an honourable peace. The Allies, however, are by then committed to total victory and do not encourage those feelers. There is also a chilling scenario unfolding. The Nazis at one point consider abducting Pope Pius XII. In 1943, after German forces occupy Rome, an SS general named Karl Wolff later claims he quietly sabotaged a plan, allegedly ordered by Hitler, to seize the Vatican and kidnap the Pope. Whether such a plan was ever truly close to execution remains unclear, but the mere idea shows how precarious the situation is. So picture those tense days. The Vatican, surrounded by fascist and then German troops. Vatican radios speaking in cautious terms to avoid censorship. And in the Apostolic Palace, Pope Pius XII praying and weighing every word he utters publicly. He gives a famous Christmas radio address in 1942, in which he speaks about the hundreds of thousands of people who, through no fault of their own, sometimes only because of their nationality or race, have been consigned to death or gradual extermination. It's a thinly veiled reference to the genocide of the Jews, but he stops short of naming the victims or perpetrators explicitly, fearing that a direct denunciation would provoke the Nazis to retaliate brutally, perhaps by escalating their atrocities or targeting Catholics in occupied lands. This cautious silence during the war has become one of the great controversies of Vatican history. After the war, some praised Pius XII for quietly using diplomacy and clandestine efforts to save lives, pointing to how he helped hide Jews and instructed church institutions to assist wherever possible. Others have condemned him for not speaking out more forcefully against the clear evil of the Holocaust. It's a debate that continues as we reflect quietly. Some defend him by saying that sometimes silence and discreet actions save more lives, while speaking out loudly might have provoked worse. Others view it as a moral failing, a lack of prophetic voice at a crucial hour. It's hard in our peaceful reflection to judge those faced with such terrible choices, but we acknowledge this as part of the Vatican story, moments when the Church's leaders acted or fear or caution, and how those decisions are scrutinized later in the light of history. In fact, an intriguing archival discovery revealed that Pius XII's predecessor, Pius X, had nearly spoken out even more forcefully. In 1938, distressed by Nazi Germany's racist laws, Pius X secretly commissioned Jesuit scholars to draft an encyclical denouncing racism and anti-Semitism unequivocally. He died in early 1939 with the text unfinished on his desk. When Pius XII assumed the papacy, he quietly set aside this draft, never publishing it. For decades, the document languished in the archives, unknown to the world. Only many years later did scholars uncover its existence and contents, referring to it as the hidden encyclical. It's a poignant what-if of history. Had it been promulgated, the Church would have formally and strongly condemned Nazi racial ideology on the eve of war. The fact it wasn't released, likely out of diplomatic caution or concern for Catholic lives under Nazi rule, adds another layer to the Vatican's wartime story. Even words of truth were sometimes written and then locked away, joining the vault of secrets until a later generation brought them to light. World War II ends, and a sigh of relief washes through the world and the Vatican. In 1945, as Rome recovers, the Vatican throws itself into relief work for refugees and the displaced. Pius XII becomes known as a staunch anti-communist. As the Cold War sets in, he sees the Soviet Union's militant atheism as a new threat to Christian civilization. In the chaotic years immediately after the war, the Vatican's humanitarian efforts sometimes take controversial turns. It later comes to light that some Vatican officials and sympathetic clerics, acting without explicit papal approval but often with tacit knowledge, assist certain fugitive Axis personnel in escaping Europe using church networks and forged identity papers. These secret routes, later dubbed rat lines, help former Nazis and fascists flee to South America or the Middle East. The rationale given by those involved is often anti-communist sentiment or compassion for individuals pleading for help, but the result is that some war criminals evade justice. This murky chapter remains largely hidden at the time, a clandestine enterprise conducted in the shadows of monasteries and port cities. Decades later, when it's exposed, it tarnishes the Vatican's moral record regarding the aftermath of war, yet it serves as another reminder that moral clarity can blur in the fog of geopolitics, and that not all secrets kept were noble. As decades roll on, the Vatican faces new challenges and changes. The year 1958 brings a new pope, John X H.E., a warm, grandfatherly figure who surprises the world by calling the Second Vatican Council, often known as Vatican II. This council, which continues under Pope Paul VI after John's death in 1963 and concludes in 1965, opens the windows of the Church to the modern world. Over 2,000 bishops from around the globe gather in St. Peter's for sessions over several years. It's a gentle revolution in many ways. Imagine the Grand Basilica filled with rows of bishops in white and red, sitting on long benches along the nave, discussing how to renew the church. They pray together, there is Latin chant in the air, but they also engage in earnest and sometimes impassioned debate about the church's practices and teachings. The council ends up making significant changes to Catholic life. Mass can now be celebrated in local languages instead of strictly in Latin, so people can understand and participate more easily. There's a new emphasis on the role of lay people in the church's mission. The council also issues groundbreaking documents on religious liberty, affirming that people should not be coerced in matters of faith, on ecumenism, encouraging respect and dialogue with other Christian denominations, and on the church's relationship with non-Christian religions, including a historic statement repudiating anti-Semitism and praising elements of truth in other faiths. It fosters a new spirit of openness, no longer viewing the modern world as an enemy, but as a field for cooperative service and shared values. One moving image from Vatican II's legacy is that of the Archbishop of Canterbury, leader of the Anglican Church, visiting Rome and warmly embracing Pope Paul VI in 1966. A gesture of reconciliation that would have seemed impossible in earlier centuries. The Council's work transforms the Catholic Church's approach. Triumphalism is tempered with humility, and anathemas give way to invitations. The metaphor often used is indeed that the windows of the Vatican were thrown open to let in fresh air, just as Pope John XXVI had hoped. This spirit of openness extends, in some measure, to the realm of information too. In 1965, shortly after the Council, the Vatican abolishes the Index of Forbidden Books, after over 400 years of its existence. The Church decides it will no longer maintain a list of banned literature, signaling trust in the conscience of believers and a recognition that truth can withstand scrutiny in an open marketplace of ideas. It's an understated but remarkable turn. The dusty index quietly ceases, and Catholic intellectual life breathes a bit more freely. Now we enter the later 20th century. Pope Paul VI, 1963-1978, leads the Church through tumultuous cultural changes of the 1960s and 70s, implementing the Council's reforms. He is the first pope in a long time to travel widely, visiting places like the Holy Land, India, the United States, breaking the centuries-old physical isolation of the papacy. His journeys and gestures, like when he met the Patriarch of Constantinople in 1964 and they jointly lifted the 1054 excommunications, show a new face of the Vatican to the world, one of a pilgrim seeking peace and Christian unity. In 1978, a momentous transition occurs. Pope Paul VI dies, and a conclave elects Pope John Paul I, a smiling, humble man who takes the name John Paul to honor both of his predecessors. But after only 33 days, John Paul I shockingly dies in his sleep. An event so sudden it leads to sorrow and later a swirl of conspiracy theories, some wildly suggesting he was poisoned because he was about to uncover corruption, though no evidence supports that, and the likely cause was a heart attack. This brief papacy nonetheless endears him to many as the smiling pope, and his unexpected death adds another poignant chapter to Vatican lore. A second conclave is called in 1978. In the Sistine Chapel under Michelangelo's frescoed ceiling, cardinals again cast ballots. Black smoke appears a few times, indicating no decision, then finally white smoke on the second day of voting. Habemus Papam, we have a pope. The new pope is announced, Cardinal Karol Wojtyla, who takes the name John Paul II. He is, remarkably, the first non-Italian pope in 455 years. A Pole from behind the Iron Curtain, the crowds in St. Peter's Square cheer in surprise and joy as the 58-year-old John Paul II appears on the balcony, speaking in Italian with a Slavic accent, greeting the world with warmth and determination. John Paul II's papacy will be long and transformational. He becomes a central figure in the late 20th century, playing a notable role on the world stage. One of the defining themes of his pontificate is his fight against communism. Having grown up under Nazi occupation and then lived under Soviet-imposed communism in Poland, he has a deep empathy for people's yearning to be free. In the 1980s, Pope John Paul II secretly collaborates with US President Ronald Reagan and others in a clandestine effort to support the solidarity movement in Poland and undermine communist regimes in Eastern Europe. Some have called it the Holy Alliance. It's an extraordinary, covert chapter. We can imagine Reagan and John Paul II meeting privately in the Vatican Library in 1982, as actually happened, speaking in low tones about their shared desire to see Soviet communism peacefully collapse. The Pope provides moral support and uses the church's network in Poland, parish churches and brave clergy, to sustain the Solidarity Trade Union. The United States, through the CIA and other channels, funnels money and equipment like printing presses, fax machines, etc., to Solidarity, often routed through church channels or sympathizers in Europe. Tons of printing equipment and communications devices are smuggled into Poland with the help of priests and activists. Secret funds flow into Vatican bank accounts earmarked for aiding the Polish underground. It's one of history's great secret alliances, a pope and a president, two men of very different backgrounds working in concert toward a bloodless revolution in Eastern Europe. The result, as we know, is dramatic. In 1989, Poland holds free elections and breaks from communist rule. The Berlin Wall falls, and one by one, the countries of Eastern Europe emerge from decades of totalitarian shadow. John Paul II is hailed by many as a key catalyst in this chain of events, not by any warfare or political office, but by spiritual leadership and the savvy use of the Church's unique transnational position. Through this all, the Vatican's role is largely quiet and behind the scenes. It's as if the great power it wields in this era is not armies or riches, but a web of moral influence and information flowing under the radar. In listening to this, in the stillness of your room, consider how remarkable it is. The same institution that once fought wars with emperors now helps topple an empire with prayers, words, and smuggled fax machines. John Paul II's time as Pope also includes controversies and trials. In 1981, he survives an assassination attempt in St. Peter's Square. A Turkish gunman shoots him, critically wounding him. Yet John Paul II astonishingly recovers, and in 1983 he even visits his would-be assassin in prison to offer forgiveness. He later credits the Virgin Mary, whose feast day it was, with saving his life, connecting it to that third secret of Fatima, which spoke of a bishop in white, struck down by bullets, a secret he finally decided to reveal publicly in 2000 as being fulfilled in his survival. His later years bring the immense challenge of the clergy sexual abuse scandal coming to light, a dark cloud that will significantly burden the church into the 21st century. In the early year 2000, evidence emerges worldwide of Catholic priests involved in abuse and bishops failing to hold them accountable, often quietly moving offenders around to avoid scandal. Many of these cases date back decades, and it becomes clear that secrecy and protection of the institution allowed horrific misdeeds to continue. The Vatican under John Paul II is at first slow to grasp the scale of the crisis, but by 2002 it begins to discipline some perpetrators and issue apologies. The Pope, elderly and frail by this point, meets with victims and expresses deep sorrow. However, critics say that prior secrecy and an instinct to avoid scandal had enabled the abuse to fester. Here we see a painfully direct example of secrecy used wrongly, harming innocence, the opposite of what the Church stands for. It's a reminder that not all secrets in our tale are romantic or political. Some are tragic and demand repentance and transparency to heal. Indeed, internal Vatican correspondence from those years, some of which became public through leaks, showed divisions in how to handle the issue. Some urging openness, others fearing damage to the Church's image. By the 2010, the Vatican will slowly impose stricter measures and more transparency regarding abuse, but it remains an ongoing journey of repentance and reform. John Paul II passes away in 2005, and the world mourns. His funeral in Rome draws millions, and many chant for him to be recognized as a saint immediately. A new conclave convenes, and the cardinals elect Joseph Ratzinger, who takes the name Benedict XVI. And Benedict is a scholarly, soft-spoken man who as a cardinal was John Paul's close collaborator and a guardian of doctrine. Now, as Pope, he faces the challenges of governing the Church in an era of rising secularism, continuing abuse, fallout, and internal financial reform. He works to restore a sense of reverence and tradition, encouraging the Latin Mass in some quarters and wearing older styles of papal garments at times, and he continues reaching out in dialogue with other faiths and Christian communities. In 2007, he issues a letter making peace with the Chinese government-controlled church, trying to unite China's Catholics. In 2008, he removes the Edict of Excommunication from a group of traditionalist bishops, which later causes a stir when one of them turns out to be a Holocaust denier, another public relations stumble requiring clarification and apology. Through all this, Benedict XVI remains at heart a gentle academic, happier writing books about Jesus than dealing with leaks and power struggles. And indeed, in 2012, the Vatican experiences another burst of internal drama made public, the so-called Vatileaks affair. The Pope's personal butler is arrested for leaking confidential documents to the press. These documents reveal allegations of corruption, infighting, and financial mismanagement within the Vatican, basically airing the Curia's dirty laundry. It's a scandal not of crime, but of dysfunction, the sort that any large organization might have, but for the Vatican it's particularly embarrassing given its lofty mission. The butler reportedly acted out of a desire to help the Pope see the need for reform. Benedict XVI forgives him, but the damage is done. Confidence in some Vatican officials is shaken, and Benedict, who is in his mid-80s, looks weary. Then, in February 2013, Pope Benedict XVI makes a startling announcement in Latin to a small gathering of cardinals. He will resign at the end of the month. A pope had not resigned on his own initiative since that medieval Gregory IV in 1415 we spoke of earlier. The assembled cardinals and the world are stunned. Benedict explains that due to his advanced age and diminishing strength, he feels he can no longer actively serve in the demanding office of Pope. Here perhaps is the final break from the old Vatican culture of secrecy around papal health and tenures. Rather than suffer in silence and keep up appearances, Benedict chooses transparency and humility. He simply steps down, shocking but also setting a modern precedent that the papal office is about service, not power. In March 2013, a new conclave elects Pope Francis, formerly Cardinal. He is the first pope ever from the Americas, the first Jesuit pope, and notably, he chooses the name Francis after St. Francis of Assisi to signify a mission of humble renewal. From the beginning, Francis brings a new style. He speaks colloquially, lives modestly in a Vatican guest house instead of the formal papal apartments, and emphasizes mercy, care for the poor, and simplicity. He often forgoes some of the trappings of his office, like the ornate red shoes or the bulletproof Pope-mobile, at least initially. The Vatican under Pope Francis continues to be a place of great ceremony and history, but Francis tries to shift focus onto issues like economic inequality, environmental stewardship. He writes an encyclical Laudato Si on caring for creation, and pastoral care. Francis also takes vigorous action to reform the Vatican's finances and administration. He establishes new bodies like the Secretariat for the Economy to impose modern accounting standards. He names a lay auditor general. He tackles lingering issues at the Vatican Bank, striving to end any shady accounts and to get the Holy See onto whitelists of financially transparent jurisdictions. Old curial departments are merged or overhauled. Isn't easy. Entrenched interests resist change, and a new set of leaks in 2015, VatiLeaks 2, shows even reform efforts are being undermined by some insiders selling secrets to journalists. But Francis perseveres, and gradually the Vatican's financial oversight meets international norms. One symbolic change under Francis is the renaming of the Vatican secret archives. He decrees they will be known as the Vatican Apostolic Archives, because in modern languages secret connotes opacity and conspiracy, whereas the Latin secretum originally meant private. With a simple name change, he tries to dispel mystique that might fuel wild theories. It's a small but telling sign the Vatican is aware of its image and wants to be understood, not feared, in today's world. In 2020, as we noted, Pope Francis follows through and opens the Pius XII archives fully. The researchers begin combing through millions of pages from the 1939-1958 period. Already, discoveries are being made that add nuance to Pius XII's picture, showing how he worked behind the scenes to save lives, and also how constrained he felt. It will take years for historians to piece together all the documents, but Francis expressed that the Church is not afraid of history and wants clarity, even if some criticism results. Indeed, one scholar found letters indicating that the Vatican knew details of the Nazi mass killings earlier than previously acknowledged, raising hard questions about whether more could have been done. Yet another researcher found evidence that Pius XII had prepared a document to resign and flee if Hitler invaded the Vatican, thus avoiding being a Nazi puppet. Piece by piece, the truth emerges. No simple black or white, but a complex human story of dilemmas and intentions in extraordinary times. And the Church, by allowing this research, demonstrates a willingness to face its past honestly, a far cry from the reflexive secrecy of earlier eras. Now we find ourselves in the present day. The night is deep and still around us. You've traveled with me across so many centuries, and the Vatican's domes and spires now rest under the same stars as when we began. As you let these thoughts drift, consider the present night settling over Vatican City. High above, the moon bathes the great dome of St. Peter's in silver light. Down below, the broad expanse of St. Peter's Square lies empty and peaceful, the black and white stones of its piazza still warm from the day's sun. The twin fountains gurgle softly at the square's center, and Bernini's colonnade, the grand embrace of columns around the square, stands like ranks of silent guardians. If you were floating above the Vatican now, you'd see how small it is, just a pinpoint of light and life in the vast sprawl of Rome. Yet, within those walls, we have seen an astonishing drama play out over ages. Perhaps you sense a kind of companionship with the souls who walked those halls long before you, We've spoken of apostles and inquisitors, of princes and paupers, of secrets and revelations. All of them were mortal, like you and me, doing their best, or sometimes their worst, in the circumstance of their times. In the end, the Vatican story is deeply human, full of triumphs and mistakes, grand gestures and quiet devotions. Its walls have witnessed the best and worst of humanity, yet they still stand, an emblem of endurance. Think of how many dawns have gilded the dome of St. Peter's with golden light, how many midnight prayers have been whispered in its chapels, kingdoms and ideologies have risen and fallen outside, but inside the Vatican the candles kept burning and the chants kept echoing, carrying forward an ancient hope. It's a reminder that even as times change, some values persist. Faith, forgiveness, the search for truth. We have seen popes who were scholars and popes who were simple pastors. We have seen the church confront its shadows and try to let in more light. Through it all, something greater than any one person or era seems to guide this institution onward. Perhaps that is why the Vatican captivates us. It stands at the intersection of the temporal and the eternal, where marble halls and mortal men reach toward the divine. In its history, we see reflections of ourselves, our capacity for faith and for fear, for love and for error. As you lie here, breathing softly, you can feel connected to that long lineage. The same moonlight that now touches your closed eyelids might be shining at this very hour on the obelisk in St. Peter's Square, on the quiet roofs and courtyards where so much has transpired. We are, in a sense, all part of this long human drama, all seeking meaning and mercy under the same sky. To rest now, knowing that history is in good hands, the hands of time and memory. The Vatican's chronicles will continue, and dawn will come again over Rome, gently. For now, allow the cares of the day to fade. Let the stillness of this moment cradle you, as securely as those ancient walls cradle the secrets entrusted to them. In this quiet union of story and slumber, find peace. You are safe, and you are not alone. Generations before you have kept faith through dark nights, and their gentle strength watches over you too. Let your breathing be slow and steady, like the tolling of a distant church bell, marking the hours of the night. Close your eyes, and imagine the cool marble halls of the Vatican one last time tonight. As we drift together through this quiet story, all the intrigue and history we've explored are settling into a whisper. Feel the tranquility of this moment. You've walked through time and seen how even the mightiest institutions have their midnights and their dawns. Now it's your time to rest. In the silence, you might almost hear a faint echo of a Gregorian chant, or the soft sweep of a broom as a lone caretaker tidies an empty chapel. The world of the Vatican sleeps. Empires have come and gone, but that little city-state endures. Its lights glowing softly at 3 a.m., a few monks at prayer, perhaps the Pope himself awake, reading by a dim lamp. All around the world, people are joined in this moment of rest and reflection. You can let go of all the secrets and stories now. They will keep until tomorrow. There is no urgency. Feel the weight of history lifting off your shoulders. In its place is a lightness, a floating feeling, as if you are a feather gliding down onto a quiet square. The night air in Rome is cool. Imagine it brushing your face. The stone beneath you is smooth. You are present, calm, and cherished in this stillness. Your eyes are closed. Your breathing is soft and even. The story is gently fading, like the last vibrations of a church bell in the evening air. The halls of the Vatican are quiet now, and so are you. Good night and sweet dreams. The sentries watch over you kindly, and a new dawn of hope will greet you when you wake. Sleep well.